The village of Finsterbach was a forgotten place. It cowered at the edge of the Black Forest. Ancient trees loomed over it like silent, disapproving giants. Their branches were gnarled, twisted into menacing shapes against the bruised twilight sky. Sunlight seemed hesitant here, often losing its battle against the pervasive gloom that clung to the narrow, winding lanes. Cottages huddled together, their windows like vacant eyes, staring out at the encroaching wilderness. A palpable sense of unease settled with the dusk. It was a quiet dread, an unspoken secret shared by all who lived within its shadowed embrace. Nightfall in Finsterbach was not merely the absence of light. It was an arrival. It brought with it a stillness so profound it felt suffocating. The wind, when it dared to blow, carried whispers that did not seem to originate from the rustling leaves alone. Doors were bolted early, shutters were latched tight. The flicker of candlelight from within homes seemed a fragile defense against the immense darkness that pressed in from the forest. Children were hushed, their games ending abruptly as the last rays of the sun bled from the horizon. The elders would nod grimly, their faces etched with a knowledge born of generations. The air itself grew heavy, thick with unspoken fears. There were stories, of course, fragmented tales passed down in hushed tones, never fully articulated yet potent enough to chill the blood. They spoke of sounds from deep within the woods, of lights that danced where no human hand could carry them. They hinted at things that walked in the deepest hours of the night, things that belonged to the forest and resented any intrusion. The forest was a separate kingdom, a realm of primal power, and Finsterbach existed only by its silent, grudging permission. This unspoken covenant was the bedrock of their fragile existence. Few outsiders ever found their way to Finsterbach. Those who stumbled upon it seldom lingered. There was an unwelcoming quality to the silence, a subtle hostility in the watchful eyes of the villagers. They were a people bound by shared anxieties, made insular by the constant presence of the immense, brooding forest. The world beyond seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Their lives were dictated by the rhythms of the sun and the encroaching terror of the night. The forest was both their prison and their protector, a source of sustenance and a wellspring of unending dread. They lived on a precipice, always aware of the abyss. Elias Thorne was a man consumed by the obscure. He was a collector of forgotten lore, a chaser of fading myths. His life was dedicated to unearthing the stories that time had tried to bury. He had a restless spirit, one that found solace not in comfort but in the pursuit of the unknown, the unsettling. His library was filled with crumbling tomes and meticulously cataloged accounts of local legends from the most remote corners of the world. He believed that folklore held a kernel of truth, a distorted reflection of events or entities that had once been terrifyingly real. This conviction drove him relentlessly. It was a faded, leather-bound journal that led him to Finsterbach. The journal, penned by a long-dead friar, spoke of a village gripped by an ancient fear. It mentioned the bone lantern and the whispering dancers of the deep wood. The descriptions were fragmented, tantalizingly vague, yet charged with a primal terror. Elias felt an irresistible pull. The name Finsterbach itself seemed to echo the very darkness he sought to understand. He imagined a place untouched by the modern world, a repository of ancient beliefs, a living testament to the power of the old ways. He arrived in Finsterbach on a gray, overcast afternoon. The village was even more isolated, more steeped in an atmosphere of quiet melancholy than he had imagined. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the caw of a distant crow or the sigh of the wind through the skeletal branches of the forest. He saw the fear in the eyes of the few villagers he encountered on the single muddy track that served as a main street. They regarded him with suspicion, their faces closed, their welcome as cold as the damp air that clung to the ancient stones of their dwellings. Elias was not deterred by their reticence. In fact, it fueled his curiosity. He saw it as confirmation that something profound, something deeply unsettling, lay hidden beneath the surface of this insular community. He carried with him a scholar's intellect, but also a romantic's heart, one that yearned for the chilling embrace of a genuine mystery, the bone lantern. The name itself conjured images of spectral light and ancient rituals. He was determined to uncover the truth behind the legend, to peel back the layers of superstition and find the core of Finsterbach's enduring dread. He sought a story unlike any other. Elias began his inquiries cautiously. He approached the villagers in the dim light of the local tavern, the only place that offered a semblance of communal gathering. He spoke of his interest in local history, in old customs. The responses were guarded, often monosyllabic. Mention of the forest after dark brought an immediate chill to the already cool room. Eyes would dart towards the shuttered windows, as if the very words could summon something from the encroaching night. They spoke in hushed tones, their words laced with an undeniable, almost suffocating, apprehension. "The forest keeps its own counsel," one old man finally uttered, his voice raspy. "It is not for us to question, nor for outsiders to disturb." He stared into his ale as if seeing grim portents in its murky depths. Others nodded in somber agreement. They spoke of the Waldgeister, the forest spirits, and of a light that sometimes flickered deep within the trees, a light that promised only sorrow. They warned him, in their oblique and fearful way, to respect the boundaries, to leave the night to those things that belonged to it. Their fear was a tangible presence, heavy and cloying. Elias, however, listened with a skeptic's mind. He had encountered such warnings before in his travels. He believed them to be the product of isolation, of long dark winters, of stories magnified by generations of fear. While he found their earnestness compelling, he attributed it to deeply ingrained superstition rather than any genuine supernatural threat. He saw their fear as a fascinating cultural artifact, not a practical deterrent. He considered himself a man of reason, an observer of such phenomena, not a participant in their anxieties. He thought their warnings quaint, almost a performance. His polite dismissals did little to ease their concerns. Instead, his persistent questions seemed to deepen their mistrust. They saw in his bright, curious eyes a dangerous naivety, a refusal to understand the true nature of the darkness that bordered their lives. "Some doors are best left unopened," a woman whispered, her face pale in the candlelight. "Some knowledge brings only ruin." But Elias was driven by a different kind of hunger. He craved that forbidden knowledge. Their warnings, intended to dissuade, only served to sharpen his resolve, to make the mystery of the bone lantern even more irresistible. He was certain a rational explanation existed. As the days passed, Elias's fascination with the forest grew into an obsession. He would spend hours at the edge of the woods, gazing into its shadowy depths. The trees stood like sentinels, their ancient boughs interwoven to form a near-impenetrable canopy that starved the undergrowth of light. He felt a strange pull, a silent invitation from the gloom. He observed the villagers. As dusk approached each day, their activities took on a hurried, almost ritualistic quality. Heavy shutters were slammed, doors were barred, and a hush fell over Finsterbach, deeper than mere quiet. He noticed small, curious offerings left at the forest's edge. A bundle of dried herbs, a carved wooden bird, a small bowl of milk. These were not acts of worship, he surmised, but rather gestures of appeasement, desperate bargains struck with an unseen power. The villagers never spoke of these rituals. They performed them with a somber reverence, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. This silent testimony to their belief was far more compelling to Elias than their spoken warnings. It hinted at a deeper, more terrifying reality they dared not articulate. The legend of the bone lantern, pieced together from reluctant whispers and his own research, began to take a more definite shape in his mind. It was said to be a light carried by a spectral figure, a beacon that lured the unwary deep into the woods, from which they never returned. Or, if they did, they were changed, their souls irrevocably touched by the forest's darkness. It was a story woven into the very fabric of Finsterbach's identity, a central pillar of its fear. Elias felt he was on the verge of a significant discovery, something that would validate his life's work. Finally, he could resist no longer. His academic curiosity warred with a primal unease. But the former won, as it always did. He decided he would venture into the Black Forest at night. He would find the source of these legends, confront the darkness, and perhaps debunk it once and for all. He packed a simple satchel, a sturdy lantern, a compass, his journal, and a small flask of brandy for courage. He told no one of his intentions. As the last light of day faded and Finsterbach cocooned itself in fear, Elias slipped away from the village, heading towards the waiting, silent maw of the trees. Perfect. The moment Elias stepped under the dense canopy, the world changed. The air grew colder, heavier. The muted sounds of the village faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that was unnervingly alive. Every snap of a twig underfoot echoed like a gunshot. The darkness was profound, far deeper than any city night he had ever known. His lantern cast a small, flickering circle of light, pushing back the shadows only to reveal more, deeper darkness beyond its reach. The trees, ancient and immense, seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal arms. He pressed onward, guided by a crude map he had sketched, and an almost preternatural sense of direction he hadn't anticipated. The forest floor was uneven, littered with unseen roots and damp leaves that muffled his footsteps, making him feel like an intruder in a sacred, slumbering place. He felt eyes upon him. He could not see them, but the sensation was undeniable, a prickling on his skin, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He told himself it was his imagination, stirred by the villagers' tales and the eerie solitude. Yet, the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step he took deeper into the woods. Strange, fleeting images flickered at the periphery of his vision. A flicker of movement between distant trees, a shadow that seemed too solid, too deliberate in its passage. He would turn his head quickly, but there was never anything there, only the silent, brooding trees and the impenetrable darkness. The wind whispered through the high branches, creating sighing, mournful sounds that seemed to mimic human lamentations. He tried to focus on his objective, on the rational explanations he was so certain he would find, but a primal fear, cold and insistent, began to seep into his resolve. He checked his compass frequently, but the needle seemed to behave erratically, twitching and spinning before settling on a direction that felt wrong. The forest seemed to be disorienting him deliberately, playing tricks with his senses. The path he thought he was following would disappear, or a landmark he noted would seem to shift. He pushed down the rising panic. He was a man of science, of logic. There had to be a natural explanation for all of this. Yet, a small, terrified part of him wondered if he had gravely underestimated the power of this ancient, sentient wilderness. Deeper still he ventured, hours passing in a disorienting haze of darkness and unease. Then, he heard it. Not a sound of nature, but a faint rhythmic chanting, almost too low to discern. It was accompanied by a soft, clicking sound, like dry bones gently striking one another. His heart hammered against his ribs. He extinguished his own lantern, plunging himself into near-total blackness, and crept forward, drawn by a mixture of terror and an investigator's irresistible compulsion. The air grew perceptibly colder, carrying a faint, earthy scent of damp soil and something else, something ancient and decayed. Peering through a thicket of thorny bushes, Elias beheld a sight that defied all rational explanation. A procession of figures moved slowly through a small, mist-shrouded clearing. They were tall and unnaturally gaunt, their forms indistinct, as if woven from shadow and moonlight. Their limbs seemed elongated, their movements jerky yet strangely graceful, like puppets animated by an unseen hand. Each figure carried a dim, flickering light, not of flame, but of a pale, ethereal luminescence that cast long, dancing shadows. These were the whispering dancers the old friar's journal had mentioned. Their faces, if they could be called that, were obscured by deep hoods, or were simply hollows of deeper darkness. There was no sign of humanity about them, only an aura of profound sorrow and ancient, unyielding purpose. The clicking sound emanated from them, perhaps from ornaments of bone they wore, or from their very joints as they moved. The chanting was a low, monotonous dirge, wordless yet filled with an unbearable sense of loss and timeless wandering. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was a coldness that seeped into his very soul. And then he saw it. At the head of the procession, held aloft by the tallest, most imposing figure, was the bone lantern. It was larger than the other lights, crafted from what looked like interwoven femurs and ribs, with a skull perched atop it. From within its skeletal cage pulsed a sickly, greenish-yellow light, more vibrant, more sentient than the others. It seemed to throb with a malevolent intelligence, casting an unholy glow on the spectral figures and the surrounding trees. This was the heart of the legend. This was the terror of Finsterbach, and it was more horrifyingly real than he could ever have imagined. The light of the bone lantern was unlike anything Elias had ever witnessed. It did not merely illuminate, it seemed to penetrate, to seep into his mind. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a diseased heart. As he stared, transfixed, the world around him began to recede. The sounds of the forest, the chanting of the figures, even his own breathing seemed to dim. Only the lantern's glow remained, growing brighter, more insistent. It promised secrets, knowledge beyond human comprehension, but at a terrible, unspoken cost. He felt a strange, irresistible pull towards it. Despite the primal terror screaming within him, a part of Elias, the scholar, the seeker, was mesmerized. This was the ultimate discovery, the validation of every obscure tale he had ever pursued. The bone lantern was not a mere object. It felt like a conscious entity, ancient and powerful. It seemed to recognize his presence, to acknowledge his gaze. The main figure holding it aloft slowly turned its hooded head, or what should have been a head, in his direction. There were no eyes to meet his, only deeper pools of shadow, yet he felt pinned by an unseen, knowing stare. An instinct for self-preservation, long dormant under layers of academic curiosity, finally surged. He wanted to flee, to turn and run back to the relative sanity of Finsterbach, to the world of men, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. His limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The lantern's light held him captive, weaving a subtle web of cold fascination around his will. The spectral figures in the procession had stopped. They stood silently, their dim lights flickering, their shadowy forms turned towards him, waiting. The air crackled with an unspoken, ancient menace. The figure with the bone lantern took a slow, deliberate step towards his hiding place. Then another. The clicking of its bones was louder now, more distinct. The sickly, sweet, earthy smell intensified. Elias could feel his rational mind fracturing, the carefully constructed walls of his skepticism crumbling into dust. This was not folklore. This was not superstition. This was an encounter with something primordial, something that existed outside the realm of human understanding, and it was now aware of him. The light beckoned, promising oblivion or perhaps a terrible enlightenment. What happened next remained a fractured, nightmarish memory for Elias. He remembered the bone lantern drawing closer, its light searing into his eyes, his mind. He recalled a profound coldness, not of the body, but of the spirit, as if his very essence was being leached away. There was no pain, only an overwhelming sense of desolation and an unutterable ancient sorrow that threatened to consume him entirely. He felt a terrifying intimacy with the spectral figures, as if their endless, sorrowful march was now his own. He thought he screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. He awoke hours later, or perhaps days. He was lying at the edge of the forest, just a short distance from Finsterbach. The gray light of dawn was breaking. His clothes were damp with dew, his body stiff and aching. His satchel lay beside him, his own lantern smashed. He had no clear recollection of how he had gotten there. The spectral procession, the bone lantern, it all felt like a fever dream, a product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. Yet, the profound chill lingered within him, a coldness that no morning sun could dispel. He stumbled back into the village. The few early risers who saw him recoiled. Their faces, usually guarded, now showed open fear, mixed with a strange, almost pitying recognition. He caught his reflection in a window pane. His face was pale, gaunt. His eyes, usually bright with intellectual curiosity, now seemed to hold a distant, hollow look. There was a new light within them, or rather, an absence of it, replaced by something that mirrored the eerie luminescence he had witnessed deep within the woods. He felt different, emptier, colder. The warmth of his small rented room felt alien. Food had no taste. Sleep offered no respite. Only fragmented images of dancing shadows and a pulsating skeletal light. He tried to write in his journal to document his experience, but his hand trembled too much. The words seemed inadequate, hollow. The academic detachment he had always prided himself on was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread and a sense of irrevocable change. The forest had claimed something from him, or perhaps it had left something of itself within him. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the scholar. The transformation of Elias Thorne was subtle at first, then undeniable. He ceased his inquiries. He no longer spoke of folklore or local legends. He became quiet, withdrawn, spending long hours staring towards the black forest. The villagers watched him with a new kind of fear, a fearful respect. They saw the change in his eyes, the way he moved with a strange, almost ethereal grace that hadn't been there before. He seemed to listen to sounds no one else could hear, to see things in the shadows that remained invisible to them. He was becoming part of the mystery he had sought to unravel. He began to wander near the forest edge, especially as dusk approached. He no longer carried a lantern. He seemed to navigate the encroaching darkness with an unnatural ease. The villagers would whisper that the forest had marked him, that the bone lantern had left its spectral touch upon his soul. He was no longer an outsider. He was something else, something in between the world of the living and the realm of the forest's ancient spirits. The children, who once might have curiously peeked at the strange visitor, now fled at his approach, sensing the profound coldness that emanated from him. One moonless night, Elias did not return to his rented room. A search party was not formed. The villagers knew, with a certainty born of generations of fear, where he had gone. They knew he had answered a call that only he could now hear. Some claimed to have seen a new faint light flickering deep within the woods that night, a light that moved with a hesitant, unfamiliar rhythm among the other, older lights. The legend of the bone lantern had not been debunked. Instead, it had absorbed a new participant, a fresh soul to join its sorrowful eternal dance. Elias Thorne, the seeker of shadows, had become a shadow himself. His name became another whispered tale in Finsterbach, a warning to any future outsiders who might dare to pry too deeply into the secrets of the Black Forest. The bone lantern continued its vigil, its eerie light a constant reminder of the thin veil between worlds and of the price of forbidden knowledge. The village remained, huddled in its fear, forever bound to the ancient, hungry darkness that lay just beyond the trees, a darkness that now held one more captive, one more guardian of its chilling lore. The cycle was unbroken.